At 7:18 p.m. on June 24, 2022, officers inside Kern Valley State Prison rushed into a day room where 35-year-old Hector Jimenez was already badly hurt. An inmate-made weapon was recovered while medical staff treated him there, yet the ambulance being summoned would never carry him anywhere. By 7:27 p.m., Jimenez was pronounced dead, while prison officials identified Adrian Gurrola and Esteban Ceja as the two alleged attackers. Ceja was already doing life over another South Los Angeles killing, one that had started 7 years earlier with green paint crossing somebody else's gang graffiti. To understand how Ceja ended up inside that prison day room, the story has to move back towards South Los Angeles on September 23, 2015. That afternoon, 15-year-old Francisco Bautista entered an alley with 19-year-old Christian Zuniga, another young man connected with the same street gang called Indo. Their destination sat behind 7210 South Broadway near Florence Avenue, where another small crew had already planted its identity across surrounding walls. That group was DNA identified in FBI-based reporting as drugs and alcohol, with trial evidence placing its membership around only 20 to 25 people. Those numbers made DNA small beside famous Los Angeles sets, yet the crew still treated its territory, symbols, nicknames, and painted claims like serious neighborhood business. For anybody outside that street world, crossing out painted letters might look like regular vandalism, although Los Angeles gangs had spent decades reading those walls differently. Former gang member Robert Olvera later worked removing graffiti around Boyle Heights, where he had already seen how painted names announced who claimed particular ground. Rival crews crossed those names out, added insults, answered with fresh markings, then sometimes carried arguments from concrete walls directly into neighborhood confrontations. Police understood that pattern well enough to photograph disputed graffiti before cleanup crews erased it, especially when fresh crossouts suggested another conflict was brewing. By the early 1990s, detectives were already studying walls for clues, while some young graffiti crews became increasingly armed, territorial, and known around Los Angeles as tag bangers. That older tagging culture matters here, since street-oriented accounts describe DNA as starting around that world before becoming more closely associated with gang activity. Different street retellings later attached several meanings to DNA, although the independently supported name available in contemporary reporting remains drugs and alcohol. During those years, some crews mainly chased visibility through hard-to-reach tags, while others started carrying guns and defending particular routes or sections like street territory. Once those lines blurred, spray paint could sit inside the same neighborhood ecosystem as firearms, grudges, coded insults, and rival names marked for disrespect. That was the environment surrounding Francisco's green paint, which placed him inside an argument that had been developing on Los Angeles walls long before his birth. One person already connected deeply with DNA territory was Esteban Ceja, a gang member also known around that neighborhood as Payaso, meaning clown. His sensitivity about DNA's ground had surfaced publicly years earlier during a Halloween carnival in 2008 when police encountered him acting aggressively around other people. During that confrontation, Ceja repeatedly invoked the DNA while claiming control over the neighborhood, eventually shouting, "This is my neighborhood, DNA, DNA," as officers tried removing him. Prosecutors would later bring portions of that incident into his murder trial, arguing that it showed how seriously Ceja had treated perceived challenges to DNA territory. The episode did not prove what happened 7 years later, although it gave jurors earlier context for the territorial behavior prosecutors said resurfaced behind South Broadway. By Wednesday, September 23, 2015, that old territorial attitude was sitting close to the exact alley where Francisco and Christian had arrived shortly after 4:30 p.m. Christian positioned himself as a lookout while Francisco started working with green paint, placing his attention on DNA markings already covering the area around them. Francisco crossed out DNA graffiti, then began spraying Indo writing over those markings, which carried an obvious street message inside territory associated with their rivals. The public record gives almost nothing about Francisco's childhood, personality, family life, or whatever future he imagined beyond that afternoon in South Los Angeles. What remains documented is narrower, since he was 15 years old, connected with Indo, holding green paint while covering DNA's name inside ground DNA considered its own. That lack of biography makes Christian especially important, since his account preserves the next movement inside an alley where almost everything changed within moments. While Francisco continued painting, Christian noticed a man entering from farther down the alley, then watched that figure begin moving quickly toward their position. The approaching man reached toward his right hip while closing the distance, giving Christian enough information to understand that staying there was getting dangerous fast. Christian immediately warned Francisco to run, then started moving himself as the figure kept coming toward the two Indo members near the freshly crossed out graffiti. What happened after that warning would turn the wall into homicide evidence, send detectives searching across state lines, and permanently connect Francisco Bautista with Esteban Ceja. Christian Zuniga did not wait around once he saw that man reaching toward his right hip, so he broke into a run while yelling for Francisco Bautista to move. Gunfire followed almost immediately, with Christian escaping the alley while two bullets struck Francisco hard enough to leave the 15-year-old fatally wounded behind 7210 South Broadway. The public record does not preserve Francisco's final words or describe some long struggle afterward, which leaves the next confirmed fact brutally simple. Francisco died there on September 23, 2015, while the young man standing beside him moments earlier managed to get away alive. That difference would matter enormously once detectives started piecing together who had entered the alley after Francisco painted over DNA graffiti. The suspected shooter did not vanish cleanly after those shots, since two nearby witnesses soon placed Esteban Ceja around the apartment beside the alley. One woman encountered Ceja inside her mother's apartment, where she remembered him looking pale and scared before telling him that he needed to leave. Ceja answered with a quiet "shh," while another witness who saw him there described him as pale, surprised, and clearly affected by whatever had just happened outside. Those observations did not solve the case by themselves, although they gave investigators something stronger than neighborhood talk connecting Ceja with the immediate aftermath. Instead of disappearing into traffic right away, the man known as Payaso had been seen close to the scene while Francisco was lying dead nearby. Ceja's next moves only gave detectives more details to examine, starting when he called his sister and asked her for a ride to a medical marijuana dispensary. When she arrived, the front passenger seat was open, yet Ceja climbed into the back, a choice she later remembered as unusual enough to mention under testimony. After dropping him off, she learned police were investigating a shooting near the alley where her brother had recently been seen. Ceja later contacted her again, telling her in substance that she should tell police she knew nothing about what happened or about him. That conversation would eventually sit beside the witnesses, the strange seating choice, and Ceja's movements as prosecutors reconstructed what happened after Francisco was shot. Christian became the surviving link between those events and the gunman, although his first identification gave Ceja's defense something they would later attack hard. Shortly after midnight, investigators placed 6 photographs in front of the 19-year-old who had escaped while his friend remained behind in the alley. Christian selected Ceja's photograph, but he cautiously said the man only looked something like the shooter rather than claiming absolute certainty. That hesitation mattered, since defense lawyers could argue that a teenager running from gunfire had only seconds to process the face moving toward him. Detectives still had more than Christian's memory, however, since surveillance footage showed a tattooed figure entering the alley before extending an arm toward the area where Francisco fell. The locations of visible hand tattoos also lined up with Ceja's, adding another small piece to a case that was beginning to build through accumulation. Before Ceja's trial reached Texas, another Los Angeles killing showed why detectives had already learned that arguments over graffiti could turn deadly with almost no warning. On February 7, 2010, Ronald Lamont Barron, better known as Looney, left the Cottage Bar on West Pico Boulevard with his girlfriend during Super Bowl Sunday. Barron had once belonged to the Mansfield Crips, yet by 40, he was working with the Mayor I Can, the organization founded by Jim Brown, counseling gang-involved people inside county jails. When Barron noticed somebody tagging nearby property, he confronted the writer, putting him face-to-face with 16-year-old Mark Anthony Villaseñor. Villaseñor had a gun. Barron was shot during that confrontation, and the intervention worker, who had spent years helping others survive street life, died over another dispute involving writing on a wall. Villaseñor was initially charged with murder as an adult, although his case eventually ended through a plea rather than a murder trial before a jury. In 2012, he pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter and related offenses, admitted personally using a firearm, then received an agreed sentence totaling 29 years. More than a decade later, he sought resentencing under changes to California law, but appellate judges rejected that effort in August 2025. The court concluded Villaseñor had been the actual killer acting alone, leaving his sentence untouched, while Barron's death remained another Los Angeles example of graffiti disputes ending in gunfire. Barron had confronted a tagger, while Francisco had crossed out rival writing, yet both cases showed how quickly painted walls could pull real people into lethal confrontations. Back in 2015, Ceja already knew police were looking for him, and his response was to get farther away from South Los Angeles rather than remain nearby. Investigators searched his family home plus other addresses connected with him, but Ceja was gone, with his mother later saying police had been asking about her son. Within days of Francisco's killing, Ceja fled California for Texas, while prosecutors filed murder and attempted murder charges against him by November. Local authorities then requested federal help, turning what started behind South Broadway into a fugitive hunt stretching hundreds of miles beyond Los Angeles. Investigators began monitoring communications among Ceja's friends and relatives, looking for patterns that might reveal where the man called Clown had gone. That search eventually focused on a telephone carrying an Arizona area code while operating around El Paso, Texas, where investigators noticed something familiar beneath the different number. When they compared its calling activity against Ceja's previous phone, the network of people receiving those calls looked almost identical to his old communication pattern. That digital trail led authorities toward El Paso, where Esteban Ceja was arrested on March 20th, 2016, nearly 6 months after Francisco Bautista was killed. Ceja returned to California and was booked into a Los Angeles jail on March 30th, with his bail set at around $3.04 million. Catching him settled the fugitive hunt, but prosecutors still had a harder problem ahead, since they now needed to prove Payaso was the man who ran toward Francisco. The answer would pull them right back toward DNA territory: Ceja's tattoos, his clown identity, and the same graffiti-covered wall where the whole case started. Once Esteban Ceja was back in Los Angeles, the entire murder case narrowed toward one stubborn question that prosecutors still had to answer cleanly. Ceja admitted belonging to DNA, yet his defense maintained that he was not the shooter who ran toward Francisco Bautista inside that alley. Christian Zuniga had selected Ceja from a 6-photo lineup, but his cautious wording gave defense attorneys room to challenge how reliable that identification really was. Prosecutors therefore built their case piece by piece, using witnesses, surveillance footage, Ceja's movements, his flight from California, and the communications trail leading investigators toward El Paso. That evidence brought the courtroom right back to the wall, where Ceja's street identity seemed to appear in more places than prosecutors considered coincidental. The word payaso, Spanish for clown, appeared repeatedly around the alley, while Ceja himself was known as payaso or clown among people familiar with DNA. He also had a diamond-shaped tattoo around his left eye, designed in a clown-like style that prosecutors connected with graffiti and imagery found around the area. Jurors were shown a drawing of a clown pointing a gun at another person, plus tattoos depicting a pistol, a Grim Reaper, and another armed clown. Ceja's lawyers objected to that material, but the trial judge allowed portions tied closely enough to identity, gang context, and the prosecution's theory. Other markings pulled the case deeper into DNA's rivalry language, including graffiti containing FK, BK, and 18K around territory associated with the gang. Testimony explained that letters followed by a K could communicate hostility toward rival groups, while Ceja himself carried an FK tattoo on his body. Prosecutors also brought jurors back to the 2008 Halloween Carnival, where Ceja had loudly claimed the neighborhood for DNA while behaving aggressively. Taken together, their argument connected Ceja's earlier territorial attitude, DNA's alley, Francisco crossing out its markings, Ceja's nickname nearby, and witnesses placing him close afterward. What had looked like random graffiti to outsiders now became part of an identity case built around territory, symbols, movement, and motive. Ceja eventually took the witness stand himself during a trial lasting 14 days, while his defense continued attacking the identification and gang-related evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before convicting him of second-degree murder in Francisco's death and attempted murder involving Christian. Jurors also found the firearm and gang allegations true, leaving Ceja facing a life with parole sentence once the case reached sentencing. By October 1st, 2018, California prison records show Ceja had interstate custody for the murder, attempted murder, and associated firearm conduct. His appeal challenged the graffiti, tattoos, clown drawing, 2008 incident, identification evidence, gang testimony, and other rulings. But the judgment was affirmed January 30th, 2020. 3 years later, another California wall pulled several strangers into a shooting that echoed Francisco's case without repeating the same circumstances. On April 15, 2023, 39-year-old Juan Lopez Suarez joined the men painting over graffiti at Northridge Ice Cream near Parthenia Street and Vinalden Avenue. Lopez Suarez was a Nicaraguan immigrant and father of 3 who hoped that day's work could help celebrate his daughter Brittany's 9th birthday. Surveillance evidence later showed Jamal Jackson tagging the building earlier, while investigators said he returned after seeing people covering markings associated with him. Jackson allegedly approached with a semi-automatic handgun and opened fire, striking 4 people before leaving the scene. Lopez Suarez died that day, while 69-year-old Benjamin Marine survived initially before complications from a gunshot wound killed him nearly 2 months later. Police arrested Jackson in Ontario, recovered his white Toyota Camry, and said he acknowledged the shooting while explaining anger over graffiti being painted over. Unlike the later prison episode involving Ceja, Jackson's case reached a firm verdict when jurors convicted him on March 11, 2025. He was found guilty of 2 first-degree murders plus 3 attempted murders, then received life without parole 8 days after those convictions. Francisco, Ronald Barron, Lopez Suarez, and Maureen entered different disputes, but every story involved graffiti becoming the spark around somebody else's violent decision. By then, Ceja had already spent years inside California's prison system, where his murder conviction looked like the final chapter of Francisco Bautista's case. The wall had helped prosecutors identify him. The fugitive hunt had ended in El Paso, and appellate judges had left his conviction standing. From the outside, that seemed like a legal ending to the story that started behind 7210 East South Broadway in September 2015. Yet, Ceja's name would surface again inside a prison homicide investigation, bringing the story back toward the Kern Valley dayroom from the opening. After the California Court of Appeal affirmed Esteban Ceja's conviction in January 2020, the public record around him became quieter while his prison history kept developing. CDCR later recorded another Los Angeles County sentence, adding 3 years for assault with force likely to cause great bodily injury, including actual great bodily injury. The available record does not provide enough detail to reconstruct that prison assault responsibly, so the next fully documented event arrives on June 24, 2022. By then, Ceja was already serving life with parole for killing Francisco Bautista, which gave the Kern Valley State Prison dayroom incident a much heavier context. Hector Jimenez, the man who died there, had entered California prison from San Diego County in March 2015 with a 26-year sentence. His conviction involved voluntary manslaughter with a firearm in a street gang act, placing him inside prison with his own violent history already established. Adrian Gurrola, the second prisoner later named beside Ceja, was serving life with parole for first-degree murder, attempted murders, animal cruelty, and assault-related offenses. A secondary court summary also connected Gurrola to a 2005 Pasadena shooting that killed Edgar Ortiz and wounded another person, although that account should remain cautiously framed. By June 2022, 3 men carrying serious gang-related convictions had ended up inside the same California prison system, where one of them would soon be dead. At 7:18 p.m. on June 24th, officers responded to violence inside the Kern Valley dayroom, where Jimenez had already been attacked. Prison officials identified Ceja and Gurrola as the alleged attackers, while officers recovered an inmate-manufactured weapon from the scene. Medical staff immediately began treating Jimenez, and an ambulance was called as prison personnel tried keeping him alive. 9 minutes after officers first responded, Jimenez was pronounced dead at 7:27 p.m., turning the dayroom incident into a homicide investigation. The distinction matters here, since public records located for this story establish an alleged attack involving Ceja and Gurrola, not another proven murder conviction against Ceja. That unresolved prison case leaves Ceja with one confirmed murder conviction, while the man he killed in 2015 remains far less documented than the person convicted of taking his life. Records preserve Ceja's nickname, tattoos, territorial outburst, sister's car ride, El Paso phone trail, courtroom testimony, prison sentence, and later custodial violence. Francisco Bautista's surviving public record is much thinner, leaving him mostly fixed at 15 years old behind 7010 South Broadway on September 23, 2015. Christian Zuniga remains the clearest witness to those final minutes, since he watched Francisco paint, noticed the approaching figure, saw the movement toward the hip, warned him to run, then escaped as gunfire followed. His cautious photo identification later became a major courtroom issue, while he remained the young man who got out of that alley alive. The wider stories tied to those walls ended with different people carrying different consequences, yet each case connected back to the same kind of street friction. Ronald Looney Barron died after confronting a tagger, while Mark Anthony Villaseñor later received 29 years for the killing. Juan Lopez Suarez died while covering graffiti. Benjamin Marin later died from wounds suffered in that shooting, and Jamal Jackson eventually received life without parole. Francisco died after crossing out DNA graffiti, while Ceja received life with parole before later appearing in the Jimenez homicide investigation. Whatever Francisco painted over that afternoon has almost certainly disappeared under years of weather, cleanup, and fresh paint. The wall changed long ago, while the people connected to it never got the same chance to erase what happened there.